All right, so we're live, and I want to thank those that are online joining us. Let me just say, for those that are online, you're probably only hearing my voice. We're having some issues with the video feed this evening, so I think Tom's going to try to work on that, but at least we've got the audio feed, so you can follow along with us that way. Kind of like the old-fashioned way, you know, like back in the olden days when you gathered around the radio. That's all it was the voice, right? The fireside chats with FDR. And okay, so a couple of things real quick along those lines. Let me just mention now, next Wednesday evening, we won't meet. I've been mentioning this for several weeks. We will be having our annual caroling, going out to our shut-ins and so forth. And I want to encourage you to come and be a part of it. That's one of the reasons why we're doing it on a Wednesday evening, try to get some of our folks here involved with that. We're going to meet at 5 o'clock at the Christian Life Center. And we'll get together in teams and pull up together in cars and the church van and so forth and so on. And so if you choose not to come and go caroling with us, one thing you could help us with, we always have some mini loaves. So if you can make mini loaves without nuts, that's important to remember. Mini loaves without nuts, because we take those and we give them as gifts to the folks that we go and visit and sing to on that evening. So it's a good time. I hope you'll come out and join us for our annual Christmas caroling. So, all right, it's good to see you. Glad to have those that are with us here in the Memorial Building. If you will take your Bibles and open them to 1 Samuel chapter 9. We've made it to chapter 9, and so we're going to start by reviewing real quick chapter 7, because it really sets the stage for what we find here in the 9th chapter. Last week in chapter number 7, one of the first things that we discovered early on was that Samuel, late in his life, when he was on up in years, he did something similar to what Eli had done with his two sons, in that he set up his two sons as judges. Now, Eli set his two sons up as priests at the tabernacle in Shiloh. Samuel appointed his two sons as judges over Israel. And basically, the people revolted. They objected to that for two reasons. Number one, first of all, because Samuel's sons, even in spite of the fact that Samuel is one of the greatest men of God in the Scriptures, his two sons did not walk in the same path that he walked. That's basically what the Scriptures tell us. They didn't walk in the same way that he did. And so the people objected to that, which now, one of the things I mentioned last week, that is a real commentary on the effect that Samuel had on Israel. Because if you go back to when he was just a child and when he was first given into custody to Eli, remember how wicked that Eli's sons were and how the whole country had just kind of been infected by it, and it's sort of like people accepted that. And there was all kinds of crazy things going on there at the door of the tabernacle. And so here now, through Samuel's life, he's had an influence on Israel. His sons aren't very good men, but rather than the country accepting that, they said, no, we object to that. We don't want that. They're not like you, Samuel. And so that was one good thing about it. But also Samuel was getting on up in age, so they knew that beyond him, from their point of view, the horizon didn't look very good. They didn't know where the next leader's coming from. So that gives rise to Israel requesting a king. And that really kind of sets the whole stage. And if you read chapter number 7, they come to Samuel about that. Samuel goes to the Lord and he prays about it, and God says, okay, you go ahead and give them the king they want. It's going to be a king of their choosing. And basically, the long and the short of it is, they're going to live to regret it. If they would have waited, and so one of the things I shared with you last week was out of Deuteronomy, that there's a text in Deuteronomy where that as Moses is preparing the new generation that has been born in the wilderness, their parents died in the wilderness, these were born, and they had a heart that was more in tune with what God wanted. So in Deuteronomy, Moses is teaching them the law. And in that, he says, the Lord speaks to him and says, when the time comes that Israel asks for a king, wants a king, I will give them the kind of king I want them to have, and they will want to receive that king, okay? Well, that time has not come here, because here's what Israel's saying. We want our kind of king. We don't want the kind of king that God would have for us. We want a king like who? What did they say? Other nations. We want to be like the other nations, okay? So that lays the groundwork for bringing us to chapter number 9. And so here's what we begin with. In verses 1 and 2, the first thing we see is that Saul is introduced. Because as you know, I don't think there's anybody here that's not aware that Saul becomes the first king of Israel under these circumstances. And long and the short of it is it doesn't go well, right? So, but here's where Saul comes on the scene. This is where he's introduced, beginning in verses 1 and 2. And we're to start with, we're told about his family of origin, the family he comes from. So it says in verse number 1, there was a man of Benjamin, that is of the tribe of Benjamin, which was located just below, next to Ephraim, right in the heart of Israel, in the nation. There was a man of Benjamin whose name was Kish. Now that's Saul's father. Kish was the son of Abiel, the son of Zeror, the son of Bechorath, the son of Aphiah, a Benjamite, a mighty man of power. So now what that's telling us is that Saul is the son of a man who has a long lineage and comes from a family of great influence and wealth, is basically what we're being told, okay? So Kish, who was Saul's father, was a wealthy and influential man. He's described as a man of power. That means he has great influence, certainly among Benjamin, the Benjamites, and you can also imagine among other Israelites and other tribes. So here's the point. Saul comes from a prestigious family, all right? Now, he goes on and says this. We're told something about Saul. And he had a choice and handsome son whose name was Saul. If any of y'all were at the concert the other night, we could probably describe him as the holy hunk. If you weren't here, you won't get that part, all right? But that's Saul. He's tall, he's handsome, he's like the movie star, you know, and says there was not a more handsome person than he among the children of Israel. What does that mean? How did all the women probably react to Saul? Oh, they swoon. He's such a dreamboat, you know. And then it goes on and says, and from his shoulders upward he was taller than any of the people, meaning that he was heads and shoulders taller. And then from a symbolic point of view, it could also convey he was kind of like considered head and shoulders above everybody, not just in stature, but you think about the background that he comes from. Now, keep all this in mind, these first two verses, because these are really critical, because here's what I want to ask you this question. What does all of this information about Saul say? Why does this matter? What kind of picture is being painted of Saul in these verses right here? Do what? Okay, it's his looks, not his heart. Okay? They wanted a king like whom? The other nations. All right, so regal. You know, and the kings and their sons and their daughters had the best of everything. They're going to be the best dressed, the best looking. And if they weren't by nature the best looking, they were going to make them look really good with all the paint and what have you, know. They could afford it. All right, that's the whole thing. They wanted somebody that was regal, all right, to represent them and so forth. But here's the thing. That's really interesting that's what Saul, that's how he is presented to us, because that's what Israel asked for. Here's a really interesting thing in this text right here. Can you guess what the name Saul means? Asked of the Lord, or asked of God. In other words, Saul is what they asked for. Isn't that interesting? Okay? He's exactly what they asked for. Now, so, remember I was talking about a few minutes ago as we got started, that when we go back to Deuteronomy, and I don't remember the chapter and verse right now where it was at, but we go back to Deuteronomy, in God's scheme of things, in His sovereign wisdom and understanding of how things were going to play out, God knew that there was going to come a time when it would be appropriate for Israel to desire a king, but He wanted them to desire the right kind of king, okay? A king that God wanted to give them. So here's a question for you. Had everything played out in exactly the way that God had intended and hoped that it would play out, okay? What kind of person would God have chosen? So think about the description of the person that God would have chosen to be king at this time in Israel's history. What do you think would be one of the first things that we would have been told? What's one of the most important things that we would have been told about that king?
His heart.
The what? Spiritual. What else?
Just his heart.
His heart. In other words, you can guarantee it. The first thing would have been that this is a man who has a heart for God. He loves God. He's devoted to the Lord above all things. His spiritual character would have been the first and foremost thing that would have been mentioned. Now, here's what I want you to notice. There's not a thing said about Saul and his spiritual life. Nothing.
Just his stature.
Just his stature, his looks, his pedigree. That's basically what's being conveyed. Because here's the thing, all right? So nothing is said about Saul's relationship with God because there is nothing to say. What isn't said says a lot. Because remember, what is Saul's name? What does it mean? Ask for God. You want a king like everybody else? You got it. Okay? That's basically what God said to Samuel. You go ahead and you give them the king they're asking for. Okay? Now, so that's the introduction to Saul. So you got to remember, it's not just what we are told, it's what we aren't told. That tells us a lot. Okay? Second thing, number 2, verses 3 through 17. So this is a rather long section right here. So we see Saul's search. He goes on a search. Saul's search that leads to a divine appointment. Okay? Beginning of verse number 3 says, Now, the donkeys of Kish, Saul's father, were lost. And Kish said to his son Saul, Please take one of the servants with you, and arise and go and look for the donkeys. Now, here's a news flash, all right? You got to read between the lines. And that is this. Israel's first king will be led to the throne by 3 donkeys. That's kind of where it's going. That's what initiates the whole thing. But still, that's a kind of a reflection, right? Verse 4. So he passed through the mountains of Ephraim and through the land of Shalisha. They didn't find them. They go through Shalim. They're not there. They pass through the land of the Benjamites. They don't find them because God intends for Saul to find something other than just what he's looking for. Verse 5. They come to the land of Zuph. And Saul said to his servant, and that's still in the area of Benjamin, right in the central part of Israel. Saul said to the servant, Come, let's return, lest my father cease caring about the donkeys and becomes worried about us. And verse 6, And he, the servant, said, Look now, there is in this city a man of God, and he is an honorable man. All that he says surely comes to pass. Now, he's talking about Samuel, okay? That statement right there, all that he says surely comes to pass, is a significant statement about what persons who play a role among God's people. What's the evidence of a true prophet of God? What he says comes to pass. Okay? So he says, all that he says surely comes to pass, so let us go there. Perhaps he can show us the way that we should go. Verse 7, then Saul said to his servant, but look, if we go, what shall we bring the man? For the bread in our vessels is all gone. There's no present to bring the man. What do we have? Now, so here's what's going on there. That's not to imply in any way that Samuel was requiring a fee. Now, that would have been more along the lines of what his sons might have done, or what Hophni and Phinehas, the sons of Eli. What it's simply saying is this. We're going to this man of God, we're going to ask him for his help, and as an act of respect, we want to offer him a gift to show that we appreciate his assistance and so forth. It's kind of like giving an honorarium. I can't tell you how many times I have had people come to me, and if there's a wedding, or I'm doing a funeral, or something, counseling, people come to me and they will say, what do you charge? And my response is, I don't charge anything. That's part of the ministry. That's part of what God called me to. That's part of what goes along with me pastoring the church and so forth. Now, people do give honorariums and gifts. Some do, some don't. And that's fine. That's not a big deal. But the idea that that some people would have to actually kind of put you in your mindset, sort of what a lot of people actually think about ministers many times. What do you charge for doing something of this nature? So Samuel was not charging anything. This was just, like I said, an honorarium that they wanted to give to him out of appreciation and so forth. Verse 8 says, and the servant answered Saul again and said, look, I have here at hand 1/4 of a shekel of silver. I will give it to the man of God to tell us our way. Now notice this. Formerly in Israel, when a man went to inquire of God, he spoke thus, come, let us go to the seer. For he who is now called a prophet was formerly called a seer. So the idea being is that the term prophet was also called a seer. So the difference is this. Some prophets were seers, but not all prophets were seers. Prophets would receive a word from God, or they had the responsibility of proclaiming the word they already had. Some were given the additional gift of being a seer, in that God would give them visions and show them things that were yet to come. Okay, kind of like what we see of John in Revelation, that sort of thing. So some prophets were seers, but not all prophets had the gift of being a seer. Just so you understand the difference between the two. Verse 10. Then Saul said to his servant, well said, come let us go. So they went to the city where the man of God was. Now you got to remember something. How did they end up on this journey? Chasing donkeys, okay? And Saul was about ready to turn back, but his servant said, no, let's don't do that. We're close to where there's a seer, a prophet. Let's go ask if he can help, okay? So you see how God's guiding this thing? Now, you see that guidance gets even more specific in verse number 11. It says, as they went up the hill to the city, they met some young women going out to draw water and said to them, is the seer here? And they answered and said, yes, he is just ahead of you. Hurry! For today he came to the city because there's a sacrifice of the people today on the high place. And as soon as you come into the city, you will surely find him before he goes up to the high place to eat. For the people will not eat until he comes, because he must bless the sacrifice. Afterward, those who are invited will eat. Now therefore go up, for about this time you will find him. So they went up to the city, and as they were coming into the city, there was Samuel coming out toward them on his way up to the high place. Now some people come at this and they would say, boy, what a coincidence. And there are some people, that's the way they look at stuff like that. It's a coincidence. But when you know and understand how God works, you come to realize, listen, in the scheme of things, in the lives of God's people and those that are involved in God's plan, there are no coincidences. God is sovereignly at work. Remember, I've talked about that. We see that all through 1st and 2nd Samuel. We see it even more here. And so they see Samuel coming out toward them on his way up to the high place. Verse 15. Now the Lord had told Samuel in his ear the day before Saul came, saying, tomorrow about this time I'll send you a man from the land of Benjamin, and you shall anoint him commander over my people Israel, that he may save my people from the hand of the Philistines. For I have looked upon my people, because their cry has come to me. Now, that cry that has come to the Lord, God's heard their request, right? But their request is not really according to what God wants. So you got to understand that what's going on here is God giving them what they want? Yes. You've heard the old saying, be careful what you ask, you might get it. That's applicable to this situation.
He didn't give what they needed, he gave what they wanted.
Exactly. They didn't want what they needed. They wanted what they wanted. And that's what they're getting. Verse 17. So when Samuel saw Saul, the Lord said to him, there he is, the man of whom I spoke to you, this one shall reign over my people. So this is the beginning of the divine encounter. This is a divine encounter all the way through. So those from verse 3 to verse 17 is all about the steps that God was ordering to lead about this divine encounter. Now Samuel has already been notified by the Lord, here's what's going down. Saul doesn't have a clue. Okay? Now, here goes the third thing. Samuel and Saul become acquainted. This is verses 18 through 26. Verse 18. Then Saul drew near to Samuel in the gate and said, now, of all things, he's going to go up and ask for help from one more person. The very next person, he goes up and he says, please tell me, where is the seer's house? Well, guess who he's talking to? Okay? So here's this divine encounter that's being continued here, all right? Now, you've had experiences like that, I'm sure. You ever had a divine encounter in your life? I mean, there are these, some call them, God appointments, those kinds of things where God just puts you in a place with somebody at just the right place and the right time, totally unbeknownst to you, unbeknownst to them, but it becomes an opportunity where it's like all of a sudden things just click. And it may be that God put that person in there to minister to you. It may be that God put you there to minister to that person. But God uses divine, sometimes it's for one believer to minister to another or both to each other. Sometimes it's for someone to share the gospel with another person who needs to know Christ. God works that way. That's why I say don't think that things that happen are coincidences. There is no coincidence in the life of a child of God. Give you an example. When I was in seminary, I was in my first year of seminary, and I've told you all this in the past, that there was a period of time in my life where I struggled with bouts of depression, and it started when I was in seminary, and there was a period of time while I was in seminary, I was just really having a struggle and just generally depressed, not really motivated, and so I was in the library one day, and I'm sitting at a table. I'm trying to work on a paper, but you just can't really focus because you're focused on your problems, and that's really one of the things that happens with depression. You just get focused on the wrong things to the point to where it's just obsessive. And you think this stuff over and over and over and over and over again and get nowhere. And that's kind of what I was doing. And so I'm sitting there, and all of a sudden, I look up, and I see a guy come down from one of the aisles out of the library and turns left and comes right at my table and it was a guy by the name of Jerry Ray. Jerry had become a good friend of mine when I was pastoring my first church in South Georgia. He was several years older than me. He had already been pastoring for a number of years, had already graduated seminary and had a family and so forth, at least 10 years older than me. Just a guy that I looked up to and loved. He was a super encourager. And here I am. I'm sitting here in Louisville, Kentucky. Now, he had since moved from South Georgia to South Alabama. He'd gone back home. He's from Alabama. But he's a graduate of Southern, which is where I was going to school. And I don't remember why he had come up there. But he had come up there for some reason, but I believe he was up there for one reason, was to encourage me. Because here I am, I'm sitting in the library, and of all places and all aisles, there's Jerry Ray. And I was able to sit with Jerry and talk with him for a period of time, and he did what he always did. He was just an encourager to me, always was. And to me, that is an example of a divine encounter. You can't make that stuff up. Okay? Now, it could have been somebody I might have been casually acquainted with, but no, this was a guy that I had great confidence in, I loved, and he was a good friend of mine. And there he is, all of a sudden, out of nowhere, poof, Jerry Ray. That's a divine encounter. That's just one kind of divine encounter. That's similar to what's going on here in this situation. And so they meet, and he says, "Tell me where the seer's house is," verse 19. And Samuel answered Saul and said, "I am the seer. Go up before me to the high place. For you shall eat with me today, and tomorrow I will let you go and will tell you all that is in your heart." Can you think that's not a mind blower? So think about this. So here all of a sudden he meets him, and then he's telling him, "I want you to come up to this high place." Now, high place in the Old Testament, they come to be associated with pagan worship, especially after the temple is built. Because here's what happens. When idolatry sets in, the people forsake the worship of God in the temple, and they start going to the high places and worshiping pagan idols. That's not what this is. What this is, there was an outdoor worship service, basically for the community, for that city. And Samuel was going to offer a sacrifice to the Lord, and there was going to be a community meal and celebration while they were there. So he invites Saul to come and join him, okay? So he says, "Go up before me to the high place, for you shall eat with me today and tomorrow. I'll let you go, and I'll tell you all that is in your heart. But as for your donkeys, that were lost 3 days ago, don't worry about them. They're home." But then he says this, listen to this. But listen, you want to talk about, here's where, if Saul wants to be anxious about something, this is the part he ought to be anxious about. "And on whom is all the desire of Israel? Is it not on you and all of your father's house?" You think Samuel is dropping a little hint about something is in the works, right? Verse 21. "And Saul answered and said, Am I not a Benjamite, of the smallest of the tribes of Israel, and my family the least of all the families of the tribe of Benjamin?" Now I got to say, that smacks of a little bit of false humility if you go back and remember who his father was and what his lineage is, right? "Why then do you speak to me like this?" Verse 22. "Now Samuel took Saul and his servant, and he brought them into the hall." Okay, so now they've gone to the high place where the gathering's going to be. And watch this. "And he had them sit in the place of honor among those who were invited." And there were about 30 persons. So now Samuel is the guy who's at the head of the table. Guess where the seats of honor were? Right next to him. Okay? Verse 23. "And Samuel said to the cook," now watch this, "Bring the portion which I gave you, which I said to you, set it apart. Don't give this to the others. You keep this one back in reserve," okay? So the cook took up the thigh with its upper part and set it before Saul. The choicest meat was given to whom? Saul. So he walks into town looking for the seer. He walks right smack dab into the seer, the prophet. The prophet Samuel invites him to this festival going on at the high place. He sits him down in the seat of honor. He gives him the choicest serving of the meat on that particular occasion. And Samuel said, in verse 24, Samuel said, "Here it is, what was kept back, and it was set apart for you. Eat, for until this time it has been kept for you, since I said I invited the people." So Saul ate with Samuel that day. In other words, what he said to Saul was this: "I told the cook to keep back this piece of meat even before I met you. And I told him to keep it back for you, not knowing it was for you." Now here's my question for you. Think about what's going on. He comes looking for the prophet, walks right smack dab into the prophet, right? Gets invited to this feast, is set into the seat of honor, and is given the choicest serving of the meat. And all Saul was doing was looking for what? 3 donkeys. What do you think's going through his mind? What do you think Saul is thinking?
This is my lucky day.
What is going on?
Yeah, what in the world is going on? How did I fall into this? What's this all about, you know? Verse 25. And so this is after the festival is over, the feast. And when they had come down from the high place into the city, Samuel spoke with Saul on the top of the house. They rose early, and it was about the dawning of the day that Samuel called to Saul on the top of the house, saying, "Get up, that I may send you on your way." And Saul arose, and both of them went outside. They talked all night long. And then, verse 27. And as they were going down to the outskirts of the city, Samuel said to Saul, "Tell the servant to go on ahead of us." And he went on. "But you stand here a while, that I may announce to you the word of God." And what do you think that announcement was going to be to Saul? You're going to be king of Israel. Now, I come back to the question I asked just a moment ago. What do you think was going through Saul's mind then? It's like, this is, Twilight Zone, okay? What did I do to deserve this? Well, he's going to have other thoughts later on. And so that's continued in chapter 10, okay? And so we'll pick up that when we resume our meetings on Wednesday evenings. Now, we'll not meet again until January 8th on Wednesday evening, okay? So we'll be out next week caroling. Then, of course, Christmas and New Year's. Then we'll be back on the 8th on Wednesday evening, okay? Now, very quickly, anybody comments, thoughts?
Isn't it something how God used that servant? I mean, that servant was, he's wanting to go home, and the servant comes up with all these, let's try this first.
Well, yeah, you're right, because it's this whole thing about, Saul wanted to go back home, but the servant God used to steer Saul in the direction that he needed to go. And then they run into the women, and they give him a little bit more guidance and so forth. And it all starts with donkeys missing, okay? So the thing about it is, here's the thing. Now, that's kind of humorous, and I made the comment, he's going to find his way to the throne by chasing 3 donkeys. But here's the idea. Don't ever count out of play common and even ordinary things that can happen in life as if they don't matter, because you never know when just some ordinary thing may set off a series of events or us on a path that God is in. Now, the other side of that equation is this: we also have to be careful, because some events, if we're not careful, can lead us down a wrong path. So Satan can use that just as God can use it. But we've got to make sure that we're being led and we're seeking God's direction. Don?
Kind of odd that Saul didn't know who Samuel was. Here's the leader of the whole nation, and his family is a prominent family don't know who the leader of the nation is. He don't recognize him or anything. That's an odd thought.
It is odd that he did not recognize Samuel, but go back to what we talked about at the very beginning, about what was not said about Saul, his spiritual orientation and focus and relationship with God. To me, what that says, the fact that he did not recognize Samuel, I think just bolsters the idea that he was more carnal and more secular than we might even realize. That's the only explanation I could come up with on it.
Yeah, Samuel went around the nation, and all the people went to hear him and to see him. And it's just odd that somebody in the family is prominent that has access to travel,
Yeah?
that they wouldn't have been to see him at some point. Just
You would think they would have been to see him at some point. Exactly. But having the ability and choosing not to, two different things. Don?
Just want to ask a question. In verse 20, when Samuel mentions the donkeys, had he had any knowledge of that other than from God, or had that been mentioned? Do you think that was in any conversation, or was that just, how did you know? How did Saul think to himself, how did you know I was looking for donkeys?
I think that's because God gave him the understanding. So the question was, for those that are online, the question was how did Samuel know that they were chasing after donkeys that had been lost? And I think it's because God gave him that knowledge. Because remember, he is one of those that is prophet and seer. And that's kind of one of those aspects of being the seer, is that God gives you visions, understanding of things through visions and so forth. And I think that that's how he knew that. Okay?
So tying into that with Don's answer, are we to see in 24, verse 24, Samuel basically telling Saul, I already knew to set aside the meat for you before I even announced that I was coming to this city to have feast and have the people come?
Yes. Yes. The fact that he had already apportioned the most favored part of the meat for Saul was based upon the foreknowledge as a seer that God had given him. Because if you remember, we read back earlier while he was talking to Saul, he told him, he said, or before they even encountered one another, we're told that God had told Samuel that this time tomorrow you will be meeting the man who will be the next king. Okay? So he already knew, he didn't necessarily at that point know if it was Saul specifically, but he knew that he would be meeting at the same time the next day who would be the king. And that's how it came to pass.
And the tail end of verse 17 says this is the man I spoke to you about.
Yes.
So he's probably talked to him.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Don't say what he spoke to him, what he said about it.
So there again, that goes back and underscores the idea of why Samuel's being called seer, because that's one of the capacities of the seer, is to have foreknowledge of not just something God communicates to you that he wants you to proclaim, but of events before they transpire. Okay? All right, good questions. Boy, y'all on the ball tonight. All right, anybody else? All right, we'll wrap it up with that. Thank you all for joining us online. Looks like we finally got the video up. Good deal. Everybody give Tom a hand. He is the man who gets it done. Where would we be without Tom and Romaine? Thank y'all. We appreciate y'all. All right, we'll sign off. Have a good evening. And with that, I am going to turn it over to who's leading prayer this evening. Brother Terry? Okay.